I'll introduce our next speaker, Ariane Pinson. She works with us at the Corps, and she's going to be talking about changes in terrestrial soil loss in the Middle Rio Grande Basin.
So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of heterodox things. One is I'm talking about land surfaces outside the stream channel. Woohoo! So I'm probably the only one at this symposium talking about those things. The other thing I want to let you know is this work arises from work that we are doing for the Department of the Army and DoD at the behest of Congress for the purposes of assessing climate change. Just let that sink in for a minute as we move on. Okay, so let's see, forward, yes. I'm talking about dirt. I like dirt. Dirt's important, obviously, because stream channel sediment is important for habitat creation, or erosion is important because it contributes to habitat loss. The presence or absence of sediment in the stream affects the performance of our flood risk management infrastructure, may silt in our reservoirs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So dirt's pretty important. And the other thing I want to mention at this slide is it's always a matter of the balance between supply and transport. So sediment will accumulate in the channel if you have more sediment than the stream can move. Okay, so we're going to talk about that in a little bit later as well. Okay, so what am I doing? For this particular project, we were looking at soil loss across the continental US. And so I've just picked up the part that deals with the Middle Rio Grande. So this is the supply part of the equation, and we're out of the stream channel. We're only looking at what's going on the hill slopes and the landscape around the stream channels. And to do this and to address it from a kind of like how will it change in the future question, which is what I'm trying to get at, we're using a very, very simple but very established equation called the Revised Universal Soil Loss Equation. And it measures the long-term average rate of soil loss in a watershed or in a parcel of land. So that's the A equation, A part of the equation. And there are two moving parts of the equation, which is R, which is the erosivity. That's how much rainfall impact occurs so that it rains hard and it dislodges dirt and it moves that dirt along. So there's a precipitation component, and it's weighted towards the heaviest precipitation events. We also have a land cover factor. So this is how much cover is there to mitigate rain/erosion, to intercept that precipitation and allow it to trickle in and infiltrate. And so for those two parts of the equation, we used the recently made available localized constructed analog precipitation from the CMIP-5. The advantage of using LOCA is that it's got better orographic precipitation representation. And then we used some USGS modeled future land use, land cover data that was part of the National Climate Assessment. The constant parts of the equation are the soil K factor, which is a measure of soil cohesion, and then slope and length, which is a measure of slope and length, how steep your terrain is, and therefore how much erosion potential there is. And then there's this P part of the equation, which when you're not doing agriculture, you just set to 1. It's how much erosion mitigation is available. What are people doing to mitigate erosion? And very, very briefly, it's a bit apples and oranges. We mixed the recent LOCA precipitation data with the earlier land cover. And I just want to say red goes with red. The blue dashed line goes with the light blue dashed line. This represents the atmospheric warming. And so you can see that even though we're mixing and matching generations of modeling, we're using model pairs that have very, very similar predictions for the future. All right, and we call these model pairs the lower scenario and the higher scenario. So less emissions, less warming, more warming. Okay, so first I'm going to show you some maps. These maps look remarkably similar. Yes, they do. I searched and searched and I found slight differences that make me feel comfortable that these are not the same maps. Yes, there was stress. What you're seeing here, so these maps, the first set of maps, all have the same keys going across the way. And what you're looking at is erosivity change with time. And what you see is there's not going to be a whole lot of change. The long-term projection is that it gets drier, but the heaviest precipitation are probably going to stay about the same. We're probably still going to have a monsoon. It's still going to be dominated by summer. There's not really a big anticipated change in erosivity. There's a little bit of change in the mountains, a little bit of change in the south by Elephant Butte, not really a whole lot of change. And that reflects our arid climate and the fact that precipitation is really controlled by orography. And that continues to be true. The mountains are not going to change or go away. If we start looking at land use and land cover, we see very much the same scenario. That land use and land cover are also controlled by landscape position. And there are no real reasons why in the future the forest might, say, expand. It might contract, it might change its character, but the locations where forest is likely to be in the future are not likely to shift very much. And that's what you're seeing in this map. We can also look at grass and shrublands, and we can see that there's small changes in that. Again, this is controlled by topography, and it's also controlled by things like where the BLM has ranging allotments, which is probably a lot of places. So there's not going to be a huge amount of conversion of grass and shrubland, for example, to agriculture. There's not the water to support it. There's not the landscape ownership to really support a dramatic change in use. And we're not going to see much expansion of agriculture from where it's at. And we're not going to see a huge expansion of disturbance. I want to point out here that we do see the change relating to Albuquerque and Santa Fe and the continued urbanization of both those regions, getting down into Belen and Las Lunas and extending south of the metropolitan area. But that's really it. You're not going to suddenly see, say, urbanization way out here or Plains of San Augustine or something like that. It would be interesting if it did. Okay. So very little change in erosivity or land use means that there's predictably not going to be a huge amount of change in soil loss going into the future under either of the future scenarios, either the lower or higher emissions scenario extending out to a 30-year period centered on 2085. So what you're seeing basically, this is current patterns of soil loss. This is the change. The next couple of maps pairs have changed. And you can see that we're going to see some change in the mountain areas. These are very small numbers in terms of annual average soil loss changes. And most of that change is down in the negligible categories. It's pretty minor, more in the lower emissions scenario than in the higher emissions scenario. And this may reflect changes in the pattern of monsoons under both of those. We also predictably, yay, we don't see much change in the land use and land cover either. We're not going to have big development anywhere. We're not going to expand agriculture into the future, et cetera. So this is in agreement with several other studies that have looked at the Rio Grande. If we look at the National Climate Assessment, we see fairly small changes in precipitation with a fair amount of uncertainty with respect to summer. We looked at sedimentation at Cochiti, and Reclamation did a comparable study at Elephant Butte, and using completely different models and a completely different methodology, and concluded that there would not be a huge change in the rates of sedimentation at either reservoir for the foreseeable future. Now, this doesn't mean, now remember, this is long-term average. So if there's a wildfire and there's a short-term spike, that's not long-term average. Okay, so we're looking at long-term average rates for the catchment. So you might be asking yourself, well, really, maybe just Ariane, your model is full of horse manure. Just to assure you that it isn't, this is the Arkansas Red River Basin. And when we look at the Arkansas Red River Basin and we look at other watersheds in the future, we in fact do see places in the watershed where we're going to have fairly large changes in soil available for transport and soil loss, and these changes are driven both by changes in precipitation, which gets much heavier as you go east to the future, and also by expansion of croplands, which accounts for almost 50%. And we did for USA's reservoirs within the catchments, and some reservoirs had a very large increase in soil loss, and therefore potential for increases in sedimentation in our reservoirs, driven almost entirely by changes in land use. So, for those of you who've heard me speak before on climate change, good news! All right, we're not going to have a disaster, which almost all my other talks said we would. We're not going to see long-term average soil loss changes that are very high within the basin, okay? And that's really related to the fact that we don't really think we'll see huge changes in precipitation, especially heavy precipitation events. And because really there's no reason to expect that there'll be huge changes in land use or land cover practices within the basin. The downside, I have to end on a downside. The downside is, of course, that discharge will drop. We're anticipating, reclamation anticipates something like a 25% reduction in spring runoff flows by the end of the century. And of course, that is the ability of the stream to transport the dirt that does get there. And so same amount of dirt, less ability to transport. So we still may see net gains, amount of sediment that's actually in the stream system. Thank you.
Do you have questions for Ariane?
Sure. So I was trying to reconcile, Justin was saying the decadal frequency of fires will increase, and you did mention it, but it doesn't feel like it was reflected in the modeling. Like you were looking at precip and erosion, but not an increase in fire rates or something like that.
Oh, that's a good question. Two answers. Answer one is that the data Justin was showing is westerling, and he's looking at the western US west of the Mississippi. That's a big area with lots of forest. The second answer, so the applicability down here is open for discussion. There is a huge land use component to wildfire. There's a huge component having to do with how you manage the forest and how much you thin it and whether you keep people out of it. And you might have noticed in the last couple of years, we've kept people out and we haven't had a large fire. We've been aggressive about keeping people out. And then the third answer is wildfire is a big problem for small watersheds and a small problem for big watersheds. So if we're thinking like Rio Grande as a whole, wildfire is a big short-term problem for segments of the Rio Grande as a whole. But if there was a giant wildfire, like there was a few years back up in Colorado, we're not really seeing its effects outside of Colorado. And there was like an even bigger fire than the Lost Conscious, was it Wolf Creek Complex or something like that, 4 years ago. So all of those things, and my model does not take into account wildfire, I agree. But we're looking at long-term average shedding from the watershed, and that is sort of an average rate of soil loss, and it does not include the wildfire.
Can I do one more?
Mm-hmm.
What does same dirt less discharge look like?
What does what?
Same dirt less discharge look like? What are some of the manifestations in the river from that sort of phenomenon?
Sedimentation. Yeah, if you can get the dirt there, but you can't move it, then it's going to accumulate in the channel and not in the reservoirs, which is great for reservoir managers everywhere, but not really good for flood risk management or other things. But I mean, that's your classic stream channel sedimentation scenario. Thank you.